This is an occlusion pass, which is really useful for adding contact shadows to your renders. So we have here a render of a sword, and if I turn on that occlusion layer, you can see the contact shadows that it adds. It's very difficult for Maya to calculate these contact shadows on its own in the renders, and to do so would be very time consuming. So we have to do a separate layer to put over the top in Photoshop to create these realistic contact shadows that really enhances all of the effort you've put into your modeling. We need to make sure that the camera is aligned for both of your renders. So if you've done a beauty render already, you need to make sure that the occlusion render lines up. Otherwise, in Photoshop, things won't align properly. To make sure this happens, in Maya, check that you have a locked or keyframed camera set up. If you followed my previous tutorial, you should. If you don't, you can spacebar to one of your other views. I might go to my bottom view down here and do Create Cameras Camera. Then do Panels, Perspective, Camera 1. I'm now looking through this brand new camera. I'm going to spin around to see my scene. If your scene looks a little bit dark, make sure your lights are on and anything else that you'd like. You then need to line up a good angle. The viewport here in Maya is not 16 by 9 or 1920 by 1080. It's some random shape. But if you turn on your resolution gate here, the blue circle in the white box, it shows you what 16 by 9 looks like, or what your final render will be. Line up a good angle of your object, and when you're ready, make sure the camera is currently selected by clicking on this icon here. Then hit S on the keyboard. You should see in your time slider that it then keyframes that. So there'll be a red line in your time slider. This means that if you move your camera around before you render, just snap it back to here and it will render this angle precisely. If you haven't already done this, now would be a good time to render your beauty pass. To do this, simply go to your clapperboard up here and render the current frame. When it's finished rendering, you can save it. Save it as an EXR file by going to File, Save Image, choose Raw Image, and use Open EXR, name it and save it. Include the word beauty in the name so that you know that this is the beauty pass later on, as EXR files do not give you thumbnail previews in Windows. You can now close your render view down. It is important that you have a floor of some kind in your scene to receive these contact shadows. So I do have a giant plane I've put on the floor here. We now need to tell Maya which objects we'd like it to do an occlusion render of. And we need to tell it to not use any lights. To do this, go to your outliner, which is this button here, and it shows you a list of all the objects in your scene. Select only the geometry. You could make a drag selection box in Maya, so I could select the sword here and obviously the ground plane. But for some of you, it may accidentally select your sky dome or any lights or anything else you have in the distance. So I usually go to my outliner and make sure I'm only selecting geometry. I have a group here for the sword and I have the floor. These are the only two things I really need to send to the occlusion render, just the geometry. I can close my outliner now that I have those selected. Now we'll go to our render layers window, which is the clapperboard with the two blue layers on it up here. Click on that. If you've watched my tutorial on UV mapping, you'll see I already have a render layer up here for my checkerboard material that I used while UV mapping. If you've just arrived here from YouTube, you can ignore this red layer here. You won't have it. I'm just going to collapse it by clicking this arrow here. Now we're going to click on this button. This will create a new render layer. So click on this button here. This is like making a new layer in Photoshop, and we can then put some things on it. So I'm going to rename this layer OCC for occlusion, or AO is fine as well. At the moment, this layer doesn't have anything in it. To add things to it, you right click, create a collection, and you simply hit the add button while all your objects are selected over here. It will add every single object, including the objects in the group, into this area here. What we're about to do is to create a material override. This will replace all of the materials on your sword and on the floor with a ambient occlusion material, which will be pure white with obviously black shadows. You may be worried that you'll lose all of your hard work and all of your maps and things will be gone forever if you want to edit this in the future. But the point of render layers is that it creates like an alternate reality so that you can switch between the real world where you can see all of your textures and the alternate reality of the occlusion where things are black and white. To actually create this material override, you right click on your collection and do material override, create material override. You don't need to name this, but there'll be an override material. Click on the checkerboard here. The render node window will appear. You need to go to the word Arnold and go down to where it says AI ambient occlusion. Click on this and you will see that nothing happens straight away, which is always a bit worrying. But if you can see the eyeballs here at the moment, the scene, which is the default beauty render pass, is currently switched on. If you click on the eyeball for your occlusion layer, OCC, you'll see that everything gets a whole lot brighter like this. This means it's worked, and I'm just going to temporarily close down my render layer setup window here. I want to see how my occlusion render is going to look. So I'm just going to wiggle my time slider to snap my camera back to the good angle. I'm then going to go to Arnold Renderer to bring up the Arnold Render view. You'll see it start to do an occlusion render like this. I would recommend the same render settings that you use for your occlusion pass as you do for your beauty pass. So my render settings up here are as follows. My quality is simply set to 1080 to help speed up this video, but I'd certainly recommend rendering at least 1440 for height for still images. And in my Arnold renderer, my settings are set to as follows: 4 for camera, everything else set to 3. We got 2, 1, and then adaptive sampling is on with the max camera anti-aliasing set to 15 and the adaptive threshold set to 0.015. The next thing to check is that it's actually rendering the camera that you're looking through. So if I spin my camera here, I'm expecting this scene to move. If it isn't moving, I need to check that run IPR is ticked. If it is ticked and it's still not moving around when I move my scene over here, it means that it's not rendering from the correct camera. So choose the camera you'd like to render it from. I'm going to choose my camera shape 1 because that's what I've keyframed. And you can see it has now completed a render, but you'll end up with lots of grain and things like this that we can sort out soon. So let's sort this occlusion out. On the right hand side, there should be an attribute editor window that was brought up earlier from the render layers. If you cannot see this, you can either click on geometry and move through all of your tabs at the top until you see one called AI Ambient Occlusion, or you can go back to your render layers window, click on the material override and click on the black input arrow. This will bring up your ambient occlusion settings like this. Leave your render view open now because you can't really trust what you see in this scene. This is what you need to see, and we can go through some of these numbers quickly. The samples is to do with the quality of the render. Sample set to 3 isn't too bad. I'm just going to increase this up to 4 just to make things a bit smoother. Anything less than 3, you'll end up with lots of noise and grain. Spread affects how soft the shadow edges are and how intense the darker areas are. However, decreasing this value while making the most obvious edges darker will cause you to lose detail in the more shallow creases, like on this part of the sword here. So I usually leave this at 1. Fall off affects how big the shadows are. Setting it to 0 has the biggest shadows, and increasing this number up to about 20 will cause quite sharp shadows. This depends on the scene. If you're in an indoor detailed environment, it may be best to increase the fall off to about 15 or 20. Otherwise you'll have too many dark areas and it will be overwhelming in Photoshop or After Effects or Nuke when you composite it in. So for this scene, since it's quite minimal in terms of geometry and surrounding detail, I am going to leave the fall off at about 2. It's just enough so that I can see some shadows on the ground from the sword. If I increase it too far above this, they do start to disappear. So I'm going to leave this at 2. I usually ignore near clip and far clip. For the things I do with occlusion rendering, adjusting these usually only causes the scene to go pure white anyway. So I usually leave those at whatever values they were at. And these 2 settings here, I usually always want my white colors to be as white as possible and my dark colors to be as dark as possible, otherwise it looks quite washed out. And I would rather control that in Photoshop, so leave these as pure white for the top and pure black for the bottom. And speaking of contrast, this still looks quite pale, and there's unfortunately nothing else we can do in Maya to make this darker. For some of your scenes, this may already be too dark, which you can adjust the settings for up here. But if it's too bright like this, the only way you can really solve it is by using the curves or levels in Photoshop. If you're happy with your settings, you can go to presets and save this preset, and you could pop your name in it if you want. And I can always come back to that in the future if I need it. So while I've been talking, my render has actually finished in the Arnold Render view. So save your sword render. I am saving it from the Arnold Render view. So you can go to File, Save Image, and make sure you include the word OCC in it. And if you're saving it from the live Arnold Render view, also put a full stop followed by the word EXR and then hit save. This will save it as an EXR file. There's no way to choose one from a drop-down list like you might be used to. If you could, of course, render this with the traditional Maya renderer as well. And I just want to clarify that when saving it from here, you must save it as a raw image if you're saving it as an OpenEXR file. We're now finished in Maya. We need to use the rest of our occlusion in Photoshop. So open up Photoshop. First of all, drag in your final beauty path, which I'm dragging in the EXR file. It's coming up as this message here. I usually just set this to use as alpha channel and hit OK. And I can then drag my ambient occlusion over the top of this file. Again, use alpha channel. Now the ambient occlusion needs to line up perfectly. If you go to view, make sure snap is turned on. And as you move your document around, it should line up with these pink lines in Photoshop like that. There might be some other fancy way of lining it up, but I haven't worked it out yet. So once that's lined up, you can hit enter on the keyboard to make the cross in the middle go away. Now, all we have to do to give our image contact shadows is to simply change the blending mode of this layer from normal to multiply. Now you may see some of these other ones are grayed out. This is because at the moment the image mode is set to 32 bits. Most of the images you usually work with are 8 bits or 16 bits. In 32 bits, most of Photoshop is actually grayed out. All your filter galleries and everything like that, you cannot do it here. So if you do want to do anything interesting with this, you'd have to convert it. First of all, you may want to adjust the levels on your occlusion by doing Control L or Command L and drag the middle slider to the right or to the left. Dragging this slider to the right will give you more intense shadows. If I turn off the multiply layer for a minute, you can see the effect that this has. So you have quite deep shadows from the levels, and before it just looked like this. You're not looking to make everything jet black like this. That looks ridiculous, but just do what you think looks good. And obviously if you do it too much, you're still losing some details in here, but something like that where you can just see a contact shadow on the floor works quite well. To convert this into a JPEG, if you want to do any further editing to it, you can do File, Save As, and where it says Save As Type, you can choose, so we can't use JPEG yet. This means that we have to change the image mode first. I'm going to cancel that out. It's good that you saw that anyway. Go to image mode, and we're now going to convert this down to 8 bits. Now it'll come up with a message saying, do you want to merge these layers? Only do this if you're dead sure that you're happy with your occlusion, but you can hit merge layers, and it will come up with this window. So it does give you options to edit the exposure of this before you commit to converting it to an 8-bit image, but if you go to the method and choose exposure and gamma, the colors go back to how they were earlier. And I usually leave these settings as they are, but if you do want to edit the exposure or anything, you can do it and make the most of the EXR while you can. But I usually leave these at the values as they are there. Hit OK, and now you'll see that all the rest of Photoshop is lit up for you, ready to use. Now you can do File, Save As, and save it as a JPEG. And I would call this Beauty, and I'll include the word OCC or AO in this, so I know that it has the occlusion saved into it. You can hit Save. I usually have my quality set to 10 or 11. Hit OK, and you're done.